The Huns are an international barbarian enigma. How strong is their influence on the collapse of Rome? And in fact, it was they who became the pebble that would bring down the avalanche that collapsed the borders of the empire in the early 5th century. It was from their pressure to the west rushed waves of Germans, until this century lived in close proximity to Rome. And so little we reliably know about the Huns. There are more gaps in their history than there is information. One of the mysteries of the Huns, which has not found an explanation so far, is where they got their siege weapons. During the next invasion of the Huns in the Balkans, the Romans were amazed that they took by storm the well-fortified city of Nisus, having built a pontoon bridge and used siege guns. This was the first time that the barbarians took a fortress by storm, not by surprise attack, when the garrison simply did not have time to close the gates, and not by treachery, but by storm with the use of siege guns. Neither before nor after no barbarian nation that bit the empire was capable of this. The main source of information about the presence of Huns siege guns is the work of Prisca of Pani, in which the author, imitating the style of the Iliad, describes the heroic defense of the Romans. The fact of similarity of descriptions for a long time questioned the very truthfulness of the written. But, nevertheless, there is no smoke without fire, and no matter how terrible were the Huns, it was not in the style of the Romans to invent their enemies' achievements. And Wagetius also mentions Huns' siege machines, but already at the siege of Aquileia. Let's try to understand in all the variety of versions why exactly Huns of all barbarians were able to master the siege machines. Version 1. The Huns already had the technology of siege weapons, having stolen them from the Chinese. This version is based on two factors. The version that the Huns, from whom they were forced to build the Chinese wall, are the same Huns. The problem here is that there is no evidence that the Shunu and Huns are one people. The Huns disappeared from the Chinese chronicles at the turn of the 1st and 2nd century, and the Huns appeared in the Roman chronicles at the turn of the 4th century. For 200 years the people of Xiongnu could dissolve in the Great Steppe, and the similarity of the name is not an argument at all. History knows a case when such as Huns nomads, Mongols, captured China and acquired skills and knowledge of Chinese engineers in the field of creation of siege weapons. In theory, the Hun Sunu could also acquire this knowledge in this way. But according to Chinese sources, the Huns were not seen not only in capturing at least part of the state, but even in storming cities, preferring to plunder the countryside. But even if we assume that yes, and Chinese engineers somehow got to the Huns, the hardest part is to preserve this knowledge. As I think many people know, there is no point in preserving knowledge that is not used, and in the practical nomadic culture, which did not know writing, this rule was elevated to an absolute. There was no one to storm in the steppe, nothing to make siege weapons out of. That is, either Huns, contrary to logic and historical experience, kept this knowledge for 300 years, or they did not have it. In general, the version is fantastic, akin to the Roman legionaries in China. Version 2. Persian trace. Huns appeared on the border of Persia and Rome in 370, but the first serious raid on the empires they organized only in 395, striking at a time when both empires were busy playing muscle against each other. A sudden blow from the Caspian border of Persia, and almost simultaneous in the Roman Caucasus and Danube, it is believed that these were independent raids, but very well coincided, caught both Rome and Persia by surprise. Because of this, the Huns traveled through all of Persia and Mesopotamia, came out to Syria, where they met the Huns who had invaded from the Caucasus, and passed through Asia Minor. A key feature of the attack was the Huns' speed and clearly plundering aims. While the Persians and Romans fortified cities, the Huns plundered the countryside and left. They did not take any fortified city by storm, although some fortresses were taken by bribery, but this is understandable. The Huns were a mounted army, and to bring with them also siege weapons is to lose in mobility. Nevertheless, it was at this time that the Huns could capture engineers from the Persians or Romans or buy them. There is an unconfirmed hypothesis that the Persians paid off the barbarians, and the price for stopping the looting could be the engineers handed over to them. But this hypothesis has the same flaw as the previous one. The Huns had to hide for 40 years that they had the technology to storm fortresses. The probability that the engineers themselves would pass on the knowledge tends to zero. They retain their value alive as long as they have unique knowledge needed by the Huns, and as soon as they pass it on, they can be enslaved or killed. By the time of the siege of Nisus, these engineers must have been at least 60 years old, which makes the hypothesis even more unlikely. Version 3. Self-reinforcement. This version says that the Huns simply looked up everything from the Romans. Like many other barbarians, the Huns were hired to the Romans as federates and participated in their campaigns, including sieges. By observing the engineers and being curious, they could ferret out what they needed and replicate it at their place. Except this is almost fantastical. First, we have the example of the Goths, who lived side by side with the Romans for almost 300 years. They participated in dozens of campaigns of the Romans. They sent them their civil and military engineers to settle the country, but they did not have anything like the siege park even close. And they were by Roman standards the most civilized of the barbarians. What to speak of the Huns, who did not even master the concept of writing? Secondly, a military engineer in ancient times is like a top IT engineer now. They pay him a lot so that he did not even think of leaving. They passed on their knowledge only to their shifts and were a white bone. The idea of telling some details of the Scorpio device to a Roman engineer was like trying to explain the essence of the tax system to a kitten. He would not understand anything. And so it is here. Any siege weapon is an extremely complex technological invention that takes years to learn how to make and maintain. And it was highly unlikely that this knowledge would get out of the hands of a small corporation of military engineers. Version 4. Roman trace. This version is the only one that requires a minimum of reservations for its existence. Could the Huns have captured Roman engineers? They could have. Could these engineers, on pain of death, have helped the Huns with sieges? They could have. Were there a lot of them? That's the big question. Yes, we are in the middle of the 5th century. The Roman army was lost in the numerous battles of the previous 50 years, and what we have now is a conglomerate of Romanized and not-so barbarians, militia, and a small professional corps. Unlike in previous centuries, there are not so many military engineers, and therefore their value is even higher, which is expressed in their income from service and in the degree of loyalty to the authorities. And even though Rome is not the same anymore, indoctrination in the army is going well. Still, these are people, most of them brought up on stories about the victories of Roman arms, about how Rome was almost destroyed by Hannibal, but then rose from its knees and gave out life-giving kicks to everyone. The empire suffered from raids, lost many territories, but believed that it would fall, could not believe many. Therefore, even the appearance of such a powerful force as the Huns could not so shake faith in Rome and the soldiers that they would voluntarily help the barbarians. And how effective intimidation could be, it is extremely difficult to say. Yes, there were, of course, cases of betrayal, when people who did not share something with the authorities of the empire defected to the Huns. But these defectors and prisoners knew well that in case of defeat of the Huns, or return to the empire for cooperation with the barbarians, they would die, and long and painful. Therefore, cases of treachery and helping the barbarians in the war with the empire was exactly treachery were still rare. Nevertheless, some number of engineers could agree to help the Huns with the creation of the siege park, allowing for a time to create a separate unit for sieges. But then it is very strange that this method was not used by other barbarians, abundant within Rome. In general, the version is the most realistic, but it does not give answers.